Have you ever opened your fridge, stared into its well-lit depths, and declared with a heavy sigh, "There's nothing to eat"? We've all done it. Or maybe you've felt that flash of annoyance when your favorite takeout spot is closed, forcing you to choose something else for dinner. We live in a world of incredible, almost magical choice, but I want you to hold on to that feeling of minor disappointment for a moment. Let it sit there. Now, let's travel back in time, not with kings and knights in shining armor just yet, but to a small, dark, smoke-filled hut. Inside, a family is gathering for their evening meal, the only meal of the day that's different from their morning meal in one single respect. It's hotter. In the center of the room, a large black pot hangs over a fire, filled with a bubbling, grayish mush. That mush isn't just their dinner, it was their breakfast, and it will be their breakfast and dinner again tomorrow, and the day after, and for most of the days of their entire lives. For the next few hours, we are going to forget our world of choice and step into their reality. We are going to explore why the simple act of eating in the Middle Ages was a relentless, daily struggle against scarcity, monotony, and outright danger. This isn't just a boring history of food, it's the story of survival, where a full belly was the greatest luxury of all. To truly understand the medieval food experience for the vast majority of people, we have to start with that bubbling pot in the center of the peasant home. This wasn't just a cooking vessel, it was the heart of their culinary world, the source of almost all their sustenance. The contents of that pot were known as pottage, and to call pottage a stew or a soup is to give it a level of credit it rarely deserved. It was, in essence, a perpetual gruel. The concept of a perpetual pot is a fascinating one. The fire in the hearth of a peasant home was rarely allowed to go out completely, as restarting it was a difficult task, and hanging over that fire was the cauldron. It was almost never fully emptied and scrubbed clean. Instead, it was a continuous process. The family would eat from it in the evening, and whatever was left would form the base for the next day's meal. In the morning, more water would be added, perhaps a handful more grains, and the whole thing would be set to simmer again. This method saved fuel and effort, but it also meant that the flavors, or lack thereof, of days past were constantly mingling with the present. Sometimes, the remnants at the very bottom of the pot could be days, or even weeks, old, contributing a sour, fermented tang to the entire mixture. So, what exactly went into this never-ending pottage? The primary ingredient, the absolute bedrock of the peasant diet, was grain. But we must be very specific about which grains. The light, fluffy, white bread and fine pastries we associate with historical dramas were made from wheat, a grain that was the exclusive property of the rich. Wheat was a fussy crop. It required good quality soil and had a lower yield than other, hardier grains. It was the medieval equivalent of a luxury import, grown on the best lands of the lord's manor, harvested by the peasants, and then promptly taken away to be ground into fine white flour for the lord's table. A peasant who was caught stealing wheat from the lord's fields faced punishments as severe as those for poaching a deer from his forests. This left the peasants with the rough stuff, the grains that could survive in poor soil and harsh weather. The most common of these was barley. Barley was the workhorse of the medieval field. It was tough, resilient, and could grow almost anywhere. When boiled for hours in the pottage pot, it would break down into a thick, gelatinous mush. It had a nutty, earthy flavor, but its texture was often coarse. It filled the belly and provided the raw calories needed for a day of back-breaking labor in the fields. But it was far from a pleasant eating experience. Day in and day out, the primary taste of a peasant's life was the taste of boiled barley. In the colder, wetter climates of the north, like in Scotland or parts of Scandinavia, oats were the dominant grain. Oats could thrive where even barley might struggle. They were used in the same way, boiled into a thick porridge or gruel. Sometimes, they were ground into a coarse flour and mixed with water to be cooked on a hot stone into flat, hard oatcakes. These were the medieval equivalent of an energy bar, a dense, dry, and portable, something a shepherd could take with him into the hills. But perhaps the most significant grain for the medieval poor was rye. Rye was incredibly hardy, even more so than barley, and could tolerate cold and poor soil. It became the staple grain for the peasantry across much of northern and eastern Europe. Rye bread was known as black bread, not only for its dark color but for the poverty it represented. It was heavy, dense, and had a strong, slightly sour flavor that many people today would find acquired. However, rye carried with it a hidden and terrifying danger. The rye plant was particularly susceptible to a fungus called Claviceps purpurea, more commonly known as ergot. This fungus would grow on the ears of rye, looking like small, dark, horn-like spurs. When the rye was harvested and ground, the ergot would be ground along with it, contaminating the flour. A peasant family, desperate for any food, would not throw away flour just because it had some dark specks in it. They would bake their bread and feed it to their children, unknowingly poisoning themselves. Consuming ergot-contaminated rye led to a horrific condition known as ergotism, or as it was called in the Middle Ages, St. Anthony's fire. The symptoms were agonizing. One form of the disease was convulsive, causing violent seizures, muscle spasms, and terrifying hallucinations. Many historians believe that some of the accounts of demonic possession or bewitchment in the Middle Ages may have actually been outbreaks of ergot poisoning, as entire villages would sometimes be afflicted at once, seemingly driven mad. The other form of the disease was even more gruesome: gangrenous ergotism. The fungus contains alkaloids that constrict blood vessels, cutting off the flow of blood to the extremities. The victim would feel an intense, burning sensation in their limbs, as if they were on fire, hence the name, St. Anthony's fire. This would be followed by the flesh beginning to die. Their fingers, toes, hands, and feet would turn black, become numb, and eventually fall off, all while the victim was still alive. It was an unspeakably painful and terrifying affliction, and it was a direct result of the limited, poor-quality food source that the peasantry relied on. A simple loaf of daily bread, the very thing that was meant to sustain life, could become the source of a nightmare worse than death. So, this was the base of the pottage, a foundation of coarse, often gritty, and sometimes dangerous grains. To this, the family would add whatever vegetables they could get their hands on, which wasn't much. The peasant garden, or curtilage, was a tiny patch of land next to their hut. Here, they would grow what were known as the humble vegetables. The most important of these were the alliums, onions, garlic, and leeks. These were the peasant's spice rack. They were easy to grow, stored relatively well, and had strong, pungent flavors that could penetrate the blandness of the boiled grains. A few chopped onions or a crushed clove of garlic could transform a tasteless mush into something that at least had some character. Alongside them, they would grow hardy root vegetables. Turnips were a staple, as were parsnips. Carrots existed, but they weren't the bright orange variety we know today. Medieval carrots were often purple, yellow, or white, and they were much thinner and tougher than their modern counterparts. These would be chopped and thrown into the pottage pot, where they would be boiled for hours until they were soft and had surrendered all their flavor to the bubbling gruel. Cabbages were another vital crop. A large, dense head of cabbage could provide a lot of vegetable matter. They were a key ingredient in pottage, but they were also crucial for winter survival through preservation, a topic we will explore in agonizing detail later. What is important to remember is the sheer lack of variety. Imagine a diet where the primary vegetables, day in and day out, are onions, turnips, and cabbage. We must also talk about what was not there. The medieval peasant's garden contained no potatoes. The potato, which would later become a staple for the European poor, was native to South America and wouldn't arrive in Europe until the 16th century. And even then, it took a long time to be adopted. There were no tomatoes, no corn, no bell peppers, no pumpkins or squash. All these familiar vegetables were part of the Columbian exchange and were centuries away from the medieval pottage pot. The vegetable world of the peasant was small, tough, and overwhelmingly brassicaceous. When the garden's meager offerings were exhausted, or to supplement them, the family would turn to foraging. The woman of the house, or the children, would spend hours scouring the local woods and hedgerows for anything edible. In the spring, they would gather young nettles, which, when boiled, lose their sting and provide a nutritious, spinach-like green. They would dig for wild roots and gather wild garlic and other herbs. This wasn't a pleasant pastime, as we might think of foraging today. It was a necessary and often arduous task. The forager had to know exactly which plants were safe and which were poisonous, a knowledge passed down through generations. A mistake could be fatal. So let's paint a complete picture of the evening meal. The family gathers around the central hearth. The mother ladles the pottage from the perpetually simmering pot into rough wooden bowls. The pottage is thick and gray, a mass of boiled barley, softened turnips, and a few strings of cabbage. It tastes earthy, slightly smoky from the fire, and perhaps a little pungent from the onions. There is no pepper, no cinnamon, no exotic flavors. The only seasoning is a tiny pinch of precious salt, scraped from the family's salt block. Alongside the pottage is a piece of dense, heavy rye bread. It's tough to chew, and bits of grit from the millstone crunch between the teeth. To wash it down, they drink small ale, a very weak, low-alcohol beer that is safer than the local water. This is their meal. It is filling, providing the raw energy for another day of labor. But it is crushingly monotonous. The texture is mush, the flavor is bland, and the color is a uniform grayish-brown. This was not a meal to be savored, it was a meal to be endured. This was the fuel of medieval life, and it was the grim, unchanging reality for millions upon millions of people for centuries. The gray, monotonous world of the pottage pot was the baseline of peasant existence. It was the fuel that kept the engine of medieval society running. But human beings are not just engines. We crave variety. We crave different textures, and we especially crave the rich, savory satisfaction that comes from protein and fat. For the medieval peasant, satisfying these cravings was a lifelong challenge, a game of chance and brutal economics where the stakes were literally life and death. The rare moments when meat, fish, or even a simple egg graced their wooden bowl were not just meals, they were events, celebrations, and cherished memories in a long calendar of blandness. To understand the peasant's relationship with meat, we have to start with the most important animal in their lives, an animal that represented not just food, but wealth, security, and a hedge against the starvation of winter: the pig. A family that owned a pig was a family with a plan. The pig was a marvel of medieval efficiency. Unlike a cow or a sheep that required pasture, a pig could largely fend for itself, foraging in the woods for acorns and roots, or eating the household's meager scraps. It was a walking, snorting savings account, and every scrap of food it converted into fat was a deposit against the lean months ahead. But the crucial thing to understand is that the family pig was not a source of regular fresh meat. The idea of deciding on a Tuesday to slaughter the pig for pork chops was utterly unthinkable. The pig was a once-a-year resource, and its slaughter, usually in the late autumn after it had fattened up on the post-harvest leavings, was one of the most significant events of the year. It was a time of both celebration and intense, methodical labor. The entire family, and often the neighbors who came to help, would be involved in a process that ensured not a single, precious part of the animal was wasted. This was the birth of the nose-to-tail philosophy, not as a trendy culinary movement, but as a brutal necessity. The fresh meat, the pork loin or the tender parts of the leg, would be eaten immediately in a rare and joyous feast. For 1 or 2 days, the family would taste the incredible luxury of freshly roasted or stewed pork, a flavor so rich and satisfying it would be talked about for months. But this was a fleeting pleasure. The vast majority of the pig had to be preserved to last through the entire winter and spring. The main event was salting. The belly would be layered with coarse, gray salt to become bacon. The legs would be packed in salt to be cured into hams. Other large cuts of meat would be submerged in barrels of brine, a supersaturated saltwater solution. This process drew out the moisture, making the meat inhospitable to the bacteria that cause rot. But it also fundamentally changed the nature of the meat. It became incredibly dense, tough, and overwhelmingly salty. This wasn't the delicate, pink bacon we know today. It was a hard, greasy slab of salt-cured fat and muscle that had to be laboriously soaked in water before it could be cooked. And even then, its primary flavor was salt. A single, thin slice of this bacon, fried until crisp, would be a family's treat for the week. Its intense saltiness used to flavor the entire pot of pottage. The organs, or offal, which would spoil the fastest, were dealt with immediately. The liver, heart, and kidneys would be cooked and eaten within a day or two. But the intestines were a valuable resource. They would be painstakingly scraped and cleaned to be used as casings for sausages. And what went into those sausages? Everything else. Scraps of meat, chunks of fat, and most importantly, the blood. The pig's blood would be carefully collected in a bucket during the slaughter. It would then be mixed with coarse barley or oats, some herbs if they were lucky, and chunks of fat, then stuffed into the intestine casings to create black pudding or blood sausage. This was a calorie-dense, protein-rich food that, once cooked, could be stored for some time. To us, it might seem gruesome, but to the medieval peasant, it was a vital and ingenious way of preserving the life-giving nutrients of the animal. Even the fat itself was a treasure. It was carefully rendered down, heated slowly until it melted into a pure, white substance, lard. The lard was stored in earthenware pots and would serve as the primary cooking fat for the rest of the year. A spoonful of lard added to the pottage pot provided much-needed calories and a rich, savory flavor. The crispy bits of skin left over from rendering, the cracklings, were a delicious, crunchy snack for the children. The head of the pig would be boiled for hours to create a gelatinous mixture of meat and fat known as head cheese. The bones would be boiled and reboiled for broth until every last bit of flavor and nutrition had been extracted. The pig was their shield against the winter, and every part of it was a brick in that wall of defense. If the pig was the family's savings account, chickens were their source of daily dividends. A peasant family might keep a small flock of scrawny chickens that scratched for insects and seeds around at their hut, but these chickens were valued far more for what they produced while living than what they provided when dead. An egg was a miracle of nutrition and convenience. It was a perfect, self-contained package of high-quality protein and fat. A single egg, dropped into the simmering pottage to poach, or fried in a bit of lard, could turn a subsistence meal into a genuinely satisfying one. The decision to kill and eat a chicken was an economic one. It meant sacrificing the steady stream of future eggs for a single meal of meat. Therefore, chickens were typically only eaten when they were old hens that had stopped laying, at which point their meat would be tough and stringy, requiring hours of boiling to become tender. Or, for a truly momentous occasion, like a wedding feast or Easter, a younger bird might be sacrificed. What about the larger animals? What about a juicy steak or a leg of lamb? For the peasant, these were almost entirely the stuff of fantasy. Cattle were the most valuable asset a peasant family could own, but they were almost never seen as a source of meat. A cow provided milk, which could be turned into cheese and butter. But far more importantly, a pair of oxen was the medieval equivalent of a tractor. They were the source of power that pulled the heavy plow through the Lord's fields. They were living, breathing pieces of essential agricultural machinery. To slaughter an ox for its meat would be like a modern farmer deciding to melt down his tractor for scrap metal. It was an act of extreme desperation, something that would only happen if the animal was too old or injured to work, at which point its meat would be incredibly tough, lean, and sinewy. The tender, marbled beef we prize today simply did not exist on the peasant's menu. This brings us to the most dramatic and dangerous way a peasant might acquire meat: poaching. The forests, woodlands, and heaths that surrounded a village were often teeming with wildlife. There were rabbits in their warrens, birds in the trees, and, most majestically, deer and wild boar roaming the woods. To a hungry peasant with a starving family, the sight of a fat deer must have been an almost unbearable temptation. Here was a source of fresh, high-quality meat, roaming free, but it was not free. Under the harsh system of medieval forest law, all the game in the forest belonged exclusively to the king or the local feudal lord. The forest was their private hunting ground, a playground for the aristocracy. The laws protecting this game were incredibly severe. A peasant caught hunting in the lord's forest faced a terrifying range of punishments. For a minor offense, like catching a rabbit with a snare, he might be subjected to a massive fine that he could never hope to pay, effectively putting him in a lifetime of debt to the lord. For a more serious offense, like killing a deer, the punishments were brutal and physical. The poacher could have his fingers cut off, his hand amputated, or even be blinded, ensuring he could never again draw a bowstring or set a snare. For repeat offenders, the penalty was often death by hanging. Yet, despite these horrific risks, people still did it. The gnawing hunger of their children, The desperation of a long winter would drive a father to sneak into the woods at night with a homemade bow or a few cleverly disguised traps. The folklore of the era is filled with stories of the cunning poacher, the outlaw hero who outwits the Lord's gamekeeper and brings home meat for the village. The most famous of these, of course, is Robin Hood, whose legend is built on the foundation of this deep-seated resentment against the injustice of the forest laws. For most real-life poachers, however, the story did not end with a heroic escape. It ended in mutilation or on the gallows, a grim warning to any other peasant who might dare to crave a taste of the Lord's venison. If meat from the land was a minefield of class laws and preservation challenges, what about the bounty of the water? For communities near the coast or along major rivers, fish was a much more common source of protein than meat. But here again, we must erase our modern image of a fresh, flaky fillet. For the peasant, fish almost always meant preserved fish. The fishing industry in the Middle Ages was a massive enterprise, especially for species like cod and herring. Fleets of boats would head out into the North Sea and the Atlantic for long voyages, but with no refrigeration on board. The catch had to be processed immediately to prevent it from spoiling. The most common methods were drying and salting. Cod would be gutted, split open, and hung on large wooden racks on the shore, where the wind and sun would slowly dry it until it became as hard and stiff as a plank of wood. This was known as stockfish. It was incredibly light and would last for years, making it the perfect food to transport long distances inland. Herring, an oily fish that didn't dry as well, was typically salted. The fish would be gutted and packed in barrels with enormous quantities of salt. A barrel of salted herring was a staple commodity in medieval trade. This was the fish that reached the peasant's table, hundreds of miles from the sea, and in both cases, stockfish and salted herring. The eating experience was a challenge. The stockfish was so hard it had to be beaten with a mallet for an extended period to break up the fibers and then soaked in water for a day or more before it could be cooked. The salted herring also required a long soak to draw out the overwhelming amount of salt. The final product was chewy, intensely salty, and had a powerful, pungent fishy flavor. It was a vital source of protein, especially during Lent when meat was forbidden, but it was far from a delicacy. Freshwater fish, like trout, pike, and carp, were a different story. They were highly prized for their more delicate flavor, but, much like the deer in the forest, the fish in the local river often belonged to the Lord. The best fishing spots were his exclusive right. Monasteries and castles would build their own private fish ponds, or stews, where they would raise carp and other fish to ensure a steady supply of fresh fish for their own tables, especially for the many meatless days of the church calendar. A peasant caught fishing in the Lord's river would face the same kinds of punishments as a poacher in the woods. Once again, the freshest and best food was locked away behind a wall of privilege. This constant battle for protein was paralleled by the struggle for fats and dairy. The milk from a family's cow or goat was a precious resource, but it was also a ticking clock. Without refrigeration, fresh milk would spoil in a matter of hours, especially in the warmer months. So, it was rarely drunk fresh, except by the very young or the sick. The vast majority of milk had to be immediately transformed into something that would last. This was the birth of cheese and butter. The peasant housewife would churn the cream from the milk to create butter. This was a laborious process, but the resulting butter was a dense source of fat and calories that would keep for much longer than milk. The remaining skimmed milk would be used to make cheese. Peasant cheeses were not the creamy, complex cheeses of the nobility. They were simple, hard, and very salty. The milk would be curdled, the whey drained off, and the remaining curds heavily salted and pressed into dense blocks that would be aged for weeks or months. The final product was a hard, dry, and salty cheese that could be stored through the winter, providing a source of protein and fat long after the cow had gone dry. A small wedge of this hard cheese, eaten with a piece of coarse black bread, was a common and humble meal for a traveler or a worker in the fields. This brings us to the final category of peasant food, the rare and fleeting moments of sweetness. Our modern world is saturated with sugar. It's in almost everything we eat. For the medieval peasant, refined sugar was a substance of pure fantasy. It was an incredibly expensive imported spice, sold by the ounce in apothecaries, and used by the ultra-rich more as a medicine or a status symbol than a food. The peasants' world of sweetness came from two primary sources: fruit and honey. The fruits they ate were not the large, perfect, and uniformly sweet varieties we know. They were the wild or semi-wild ancestors of our modern fruits. Apples were often small, hard, and tart, more like crab apples. They were good for making cider but not always pleasant to eat raw. Pears were often gritty. Berries, foraged from the hedgerows in the summer, were a wonderful treat. A handful of wild blackberries, raspberries, or strawberries was a burst of intense, sweet and sour flavor in a world of blandness. But their season was painfully short. For most of the year, the only fruit available was fruit that had been preserved, usually by drying. Apples and pears would be sliced and dried into leathery rings, their sweetness concentrated but their fresh juiciness completely gone. The most important sweetener, by far, was honey. Beekeeping was a vital skill, and many peasant families would have kept a few beehives, known as kips, which were woven straw domes. Honey was a magical substance. It was a source of intense sweetness for their food. It was the base for the alcoholic drink mead, and it was also used as a medicine for wounds and sore throats. Its natural antibacterial properties also meant it was a good preservative. Fruits might be packed in honey to preserve them through the winter, but honey was still a valuable commodity, to be used sparingly. A drizzle of honey on a piece of bread or in the pottage was a special treat, a moment of pure pleasure in a hard life. All of these struggles for meat, for fish, for dairy, for sweetness were governed by one overarching principle: the war against rot. In a world without refrigeration, preserving food was not a hobby, it was the single most important set of skills a family could possess. Their very survival through the winter depended on their ability to salt, dry, smoke, and pickle the fleeting bounty of the summer and autumn. This constant need for preservation is perhaps the single biggest reason why medieval food for the common person was so often tough, salty, sour, and a world away from the fresh flavors we prize today. It was a diet shaped not by the pursuit of pleasure, but by the desperate, relentless fight against decay. We have spent a long time in the dark, smoky confines of the peasant's hut, a world defined by the color gray, the texture of mush, and the gnawing anxiety of scarcity. Now, I want you to banish that image from your mind. We are going to leave the muddy village path and travel up the hill, past the stone curtain walls, and into the heart of the castle. We are about to enter a world where food was not just about survival, but about power, spectacle, and a level of extravagant waste that would have made a peasant weep. Welcome to the medieval feast. To even begin to understand the noble feast, we must first understand that it was rarely just a meal. It was a carefully orchestrated piece of theater. Every single element, from the seating arrangement to the food itself, was designed to reinforce the social hierarchy and broadcast the host's immense wealth and status. A king or a powerful duke didn't just throw a dinner party, he staged a political event. This was where alliances were forged, loyalties were tested, and rivals were intimidated, all through the language of food. The setting itself was a statement. The great hall of a castle was a cavernous space, designed to impress. The ceilings were high, with massive wooden beams. The walls were hung with rich tapestries depicting heroic battles or intricate hunting scenes. At one end of the hall, on a raised platform called a dais, sat the high table. This was the stage. Here, the lord, his lady, and the guests of the highest honor would sit, literally looking down on everyone else. The most important position was in the center, and status decreased as you moved outwards. Below the dais, long trestle tables were set up for the lesser knights, squires, and other members of the household. Your importance in the medieval world could be measured by how close you sat to the lord's table. And at the very bottom, near the doors, sat the least important people, getting the worst cuts of food and the dregs of the wine. Before the food even arrived, the ceremony began. Guests would be led to their seats by a marshal. Water, often scented with rose petals or other herbs, would be brought around in ornate ewers and basins for guests to wash their hands, a necessary ritual in a time when people ate primarily with their fingers. Utensils were minimal. Everyone would have a knife, which they often brought themselves, and a spoon for soups or sauces. The fork, while it existed in Italy, was largely unknown or even viewed with suspicion in the rest of Europe. sometimes condemned by the church as an effeminate and diabolical instrument, instead of individual plates. As we've briefly touched on, the primary vessel for food was the trencher, for the high table. These might be made of silver or even gold, but for most guests, the trencher was a thick, square slab of stale bread, typically a coarse wholemeal loaf that was several days old. It was the perfect edible plate, firm enough to hold a serving of meat and porous enough to soak up the rich sauces and gravies. This single detail reveals the chasm between the noble and the peasant. The very substance that was the peasant's entire meal of bread was used by the noble as a disposable plate. At the end of the meal, these sauce-soaked trenchers were collected in a voiding basket and were supposed to be given as alms to the poor waiting at the castle gates. For a starving beggar, receiving a trencher drenched in the spiced gravy of a venison roast was the closest they would ever get to tasting the food of their masters. Now, let's talk about the food itself, which arrived in a magnificent procession. The meal was not structured in the way we understand it, with an appetizer, a main course, and a dessert. Instead, it was served in courses, but each course was a massive collection of many different dishes brought out all at once. A major feast might have 3, 4, or even more courses, with each course featuring a dozen or more distinct dishes. The variety was staggering. The sheer volume of food was intended to overwhelm the senses. The kitchens of a great castle were a world away from the single pottage pot of the peasant. They were a vast, complex operation, a sort of medieval factory dedicated to producing culinary extravagance. The master cook was not a humble servant, he was a high-ranking, well-paid artist, a temperamental genius who commanded a small army of specialized staff. There were scullions to wash the pots, spit boys whose entire job was to sit by the roaring fires turning the roasting spits, bakers for the bread and pastries, and saucers who mastered the complex art of medieval sauces. The centerpiece of any great feast was always the meat, and the guiding principle was spectacle. While a peasant dreamed of a slice of bacon, the noble feast featured whole roasted animals as a matter of course. A roasted pig was standard, a roasted calf was better. But for a truly impressive display, the cook would turn to what were known as the noble birds. A swan, after being roasted, would be meticulously redressed in its own skin and feathers, its neck propped up with sticks, to be presented at the table as if it were still alive and gliding on a lake of gravy. Peacocks were treated similarly, their magnificent tail feathers fanned out in a dazzling display. These birds were not particularly delicious. A swan is said to be tough and oily, but that was beside the point. The point was the visual shock and awe, the unmistakable message that the host was so wealthy he could afford to eat something so beautiful and rare. Hunting was the sport of the aristocracy, and the feast was where they showed off the bounty of their private forests. There would be entire haunches of venison, roasted wild boar with crackling skin, and countless smaller game birds like partridges, pheasants, and woodcocks, often baked into enormous pies. One famous medieval dish was the cottontress, a fantastical beast created by sewing the front half of a piglet onto the back half of a large chicken, a capon, then roasting it and presenting it as if it were a single creature. Another was the 4-and-20 blackbird's pie, where live birds would be placed inside a pre-baked pie crust, a coffin, as it was called. Just before serving, when the pie was cut open at the table, the birds would fly out, creating a moment of surprise and delight for the guests. Again, this was food as entertainment, as magic, but what truly separated the food of the nobility from that of everyone else was the liberal, almost ostentatious, use of spices. The spice coffer in the castle kitchen was a locked treasure chest, and its contents were worth a fortune. While a peasant seasoned his food with garlic and mustard seed, the noble's palate was accustomed to the warm, exotic flavors of the East. Black pepper, the king of spices, was used in abundance. Cinnamon and ginger gave a sweet, pungent heat to meat dishes. Cloves provided a warm, aromatic depth. Nutmeg and mace were used in both sweet and savory preparations. But the most prized spice of all was saffron, harvested from the tiny stigmas of the crocus flower. Saffron was astronomically expensive, worth more than its weight in gold. Its primary value was not just its delicate, hay-like flavor, but its ability to impart a brilliant, golden yellow color to food. In a world where most food was brown or gray, A dish that glowed with the color of gold was the ultimate status symbol. Saffron was used to color sauces, custards, and even the bread for the high table, turning the mundane into the magnificent. The host was not just serving food, he was serving his guests liquid gold. This love of vibrant color extended to everything on the table. Cooks would use natural food colorings to create dishes of startling intensity. A green sauce might be made from parsley and other herbs, a red from sandalwood or alkanet root, a blue from the petals of a borage flower. A feast was a painter's palette, a riot of color designed to delight the eye before it ever reached the mouth. They loved to create dishes that were not what they seemed. Mock meat dishes, especially popular during the meatless days of Lent, would involve a cook painstakingly molding almond paste or ground fish to look exactly like a roasted chicken or a haunch of venison. This was the pinnacle of culinary skill, the ability to deceive the senses and transform humble ingredients into a vision of luxury. Between the massive courses, the entertainment would continue with the presentation of subtleties. These were purely decorative sculptures, often made from sugar paste, marzipan, or wax, and they were the high point of the cook's artistry. A subtlety could be a miniature, edible castle complete with knights and banners. It might be a religious scene, or a depiction of a mythical beast. Often, these subtleties carried a political message, perhaps depicting the coat of arms of an honored guest or commemorating a recent military victory. They were brought into the great hall with a flourish of trumpets, paraded around for all to see and admire. Before being placed on the high table, they were rarely eaten. Their purpose was to be a topic of conversation and a testament to the host's refined taste and bottomless resources. And what did they drink to wash down this mountain of food? The ale served in the castle was nothing like the weak, watery swill of the village alehouse. It was strong, rich, and flavorful, but the true high-status drink was wine. Wine was mostly imported from France, from regions like Bordeaux and Burgundy, and the cost of transporting it in wooden barrels over land and sea made it a significant luxury. The wealthy also drank spiced wines, like Hippocras, a potent mixture of red wine, sugar, and a heady blend of spices like cinnamon, cloves, and ginger. This was drunk as a digestive aid at the end of the meal, a sweet and fiery conclusion to the feast. However, even within this bubble of incredible luxury, the fundamental problems of the medieval food world could not be entirely escaped. The same lack of refrigeration that forced the peasant to heavily salt his pork meant that the castle cook was in a constant battle against spoilage. The vast quantities of meat required for a feast meant that much of it had to be procured days in advance. In a world without thermometers or an understanding of bacteria, the cook relied on his nose and experience to judge if a piece of meat was still safe to serve. The heavy use of spices was not just for flavor, it was also a brilliant way to mask the taste of meat that was beginning to turn a little off. Food poisoning was a constant risk. Even at the royal table, a sudden illness sweeping through the court after a feast was not an uncommon occurrence. Furthermore, the sheer excess of the feast often took a physical toll on the diners. Gluttony was officially a sin, but at a feast, it was practically a requirement. To refuse a dish was to insult your host. To eat sparingly was to suggest you were not enjoying yourself. The nobility, especially the men, suffered from a range of health problems related to their incredibly rich, meat-heavy diet and excessive alcohol consumption. Gout, a painful inflammatory condition of the joints, was known as the disease of kings because it was so common among the wealthy whose diets were rich in meat and wine. Their teeth, constantly exposed to sugary subtleties and sweet wines, were often in a terrible state of decay. In a grim irony, while the peasant suffered from diseases of deficiency, the noble suffered from diseases of excess. The medieval feast, therefore, was a world of dazzling contradictions. It was a place of incredible artistry and crude gluttony. It was a display of immense power and a source of potential sickness. But more than anything, it was the ultimate expression of the profound, unbreachable inequality that defined the medieval world. As the lord and his guests feasted on peacocks and spiced wine, the world of the peasant is the world of perpetual pottage, of street Anthony's fire, of the desperate hope for a salted herring. It might as well have been on another planet. It was this vast, cavernous gulf between the two experiences of eating that truly explains why, for most people, Food in the Middle Ages sucked. It wasn't just that their own food was bad, it was that they lived in the shadow of a world where food was a magical, unattainable dream. We have now seen the two extremes of the medieval table, the peasant's bowl of gruel and the noble's groaning board. But the story of medieval food is about more than just what was eaten. It's about why the disparity was so vast and how this chasm was maintained, not by accident, but by a rigid and interlocking system of laws, religious doctrines, and social customs. The hunger of the peasant was not merely a consequence of poor harvests, it was a structural element of the medieval world, legally enforced and morally justified. Let's return to the most fundamental source of all food, the land itself. In the feudal system, the peasant did not own the land he worked. He was a tenant, a serf, legally bound to a patch of earth that was the property of his lord. He was not free to leave. His life was spent toiling to cultivate crops, not for his own benefit, but for the benefit of the manor. A significant portion of his harvest, often the best portion, went directly to the lord as rent. On top of this, he was required to work a certain number of days each week on the lord's personal land, the domain, cultivating the wheat and tending the livestock that would supply the castle's kitchens. What was left for his own family was the remainder, the meager surplus from his own small plot. This system was designed to funnel wealth upwards, and wealth, in this agricultural society, was food. The law did not just allow this, it enforced it with the threat of violence. A serf who withheld his share of the grain or refused to perform his labor service could be evicted, beaten, or imprisoned. The very legal framework of society was built to ensure that the castle larder was full, even if the peasant's hut was empty. This legal control extended beyond the cultivated fields. As we've discussed, the forests, the rivers, and the uncultivated wastes were not common property. They were the lord's private preserve. The forest laws, introduced to England by William the Conqueror and mirrored in various forms across Europe, were a particularly brutal instrument of this control. These laws were not about conservation in the modern sense, they were about protecting the lord's venison, any game animal, and the woodland habitat that supported it, for his exclusive hunting pleasure. Under forest law, a vast swath of the country was designated as royal or noble forest. Within these boundaries, a peasant was forbidden from doing almost anything that might disturb the game. He couldn't clear land for a new field. He couldn't gather firewood without permission. He couldn't even allow his own pigs to forage for acorns if it was deemed to be interfering with the wild boar. And, of course, he could not hunt. The punishments for doing so were a stark illustration of the value placed on a nobleman's sport versus a peasant's life. Killing a deer was often treated as a crime equivalent to murdering a human being. A man could be executed for feeding his family, a law that bred a deep and simmering resentment that festered for centuries. This legal framework created a landscape of unget-at-table food. A peasant could literally be starving, surrounded by a forest teeming with rabbits and birds, and be legally powerless to touch them. It was a constant, visible reminder of his powerlessness. The fat deer represented a life of ease and plenty that was not for him, a world he could see but never enter. The towns and cities had their own complex web of regulations that controlled the food supply. Here, the power lay with the guilds, the Bakers' Guild, the Butchers' Guild, the Brewers' Guild. These were powerful organizations that acted as a cartel, controlling who was allowed to produce and sell food, and at what price. On one hand, the guilds provided a measure of quality control. As we saw with the assize of bread and ale, they were responsible for punishing members who cheated customers, as this damaged the reputation of the entire guild. But on the other hand, they stifled competition and kept prices high. A peasant who brought his own grain to town to be ground into flour had to use the lord's mill and pay a fee. A baker who wanted to set up shop had to be approved by the guild, a process that was often prohibitively expensive and biased towards established families. This system ensured that a chain of middlemen, each taking their cut, stood between the producer in the field and the consumer in the city. For the urban poor, this meant that even when food was available, it was often priced just beyond their reach. Into this world of legal and economic control stepped the most powerful institution of all, the church. The church's influence over the medieval mind was absolute, and its doctrines provided the moral and spiritual justification for the entire feudal system. The prevailing social theory, heavily promoted by the church, was that of the three estates or three orders: those who pray, the clergy, those who fight, the nobility, and those who work, the peasantry. Each estate had its divinely ordained role, and to question this order was to question God's plan for humanity. The peasant's lot was to labor and suffer patiently on earth, and his reward would come in the afterlife. This was a powerful message for keeping a hungry and overworked population in its place. The church's direct influence on food, however, came through its extensive calendar of fasting and feasting. As we've seen, this calendar was a major feature of medieval life, dictating what could be eaten and when. But the doctrine of fasting, while framed as a universal requirement for all Christians, had a profoundly unequal impact. Lent was the most extreme example. For 40 days, all meat, eggs, and dairy were forbidden. For the nobleman, this was a culinary puzzle, a chance for his cook to show off his skill by creating extravagant fish dishes and elaborate illusions with almond milk and ground nuts. It was a change, but not necessarily a hardship. For the peasant, however, this was catastrophic. His diet was already teetering on the edge of nutritional deficiency. The few eggs from his chickens and the hard cheese from his cow's milk were vital sources of protein and fat. To remove them for over a month, especially in the late winter when the previous year's stores were nearly gone, could push a family from malnourishment into active starvation. The church taught that this physical suffering was spiritually cleansing, that it brought one closer to the suffering of Christ. But for a peasant watching his child grow weaker from a diet of thin gruel and boiled turnips, this must have been a difficult doctrine to swallow. The fasting rules, created by a well-fed clergy and easily navigated by a wealthy nobility, fell with crushing weight upon the shoulders of the poor. The church was also a massive landowner, one of the largest and wealthiest in Europe. Monasteries and abbeys controlled vast tracts of the most fertile land, operated their own mills and breweries, and enjoyed legal privileges that placed them outside the authority of local lords. While monasteries were often centers of agricultural innovation and did engage in charity, their primary function was to sustain themselves and accumulate wealth. The tithe, a mandatory tax of 10% of a peasant's produce, went to the church. This was another huge drain on the peasant family's already meager food supply. A tenth of their grain, a tenth of their animals, a tenth of their cheese all had to be handed over before they could even begin to feed themselves or pay their rent to the Lord. The combined pressure of the Lord's demands, the church's tithes, and the restrictive laws created a system where the peasant was trapped in a state of perpetual food insecurity. His labor produced an abundance of food, but he was legally and morally entitled to only the barest minimum required to keep him alive and working. Did the peasants accept this state of affairs quietly? For the most part, they had no choice. Open rebellion was a suicidal act against the overwhelming military power of the nobility, but resentment was a constant, simmering undercurrent in medieval society. This resentment found its voice in folk tales, songs, and proverbs. The character of the greedy, gluttonous friar, the cruel, unjust lord, and the heroic, food-providing outlaw like Robin Hood. These were not just stories, they were a form of cultural resistance, a way of expressing a deep sense of injustice. Occasionally, however, this simmering resentment would boil over into open, violent revolt. The history of the Middle Ages is punctuated by peasant uprisings, and almost all of them had hunger and food injustice at their core. During the catastrophic Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, a period of relentless rain and failed crops, chronicles report bands of starving peasants attacking manor houses and raiding granaries. The most famous of these rebellions was the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381. While sparked by a new poll tax, its roots lay in the deep-seated anger over the injustices of the feudal system. One of the leaders, a priest named John Ball, famously preached a sermon to the rebels with the radical question, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" It was a direct challenge to the divinely ordained social order, an assertion that all people were created equal and that the nobility's claim to the land and its bounty was illegitimate. The rebels marched on London, demanding an end to serfdom and a fairer distribution of wealth. These revolts were almost always crushed with brutal efficiency. The leaders were executed, and the old order was violently reimposed. But they are a crucial part of the story of medieval food. They show that the peasant was not a passive victim. He was acutely aware of the injustice of his situation. He knew that his hunger was not an accident of nature but a product of a system designed to keep him hungry. The struggle for food was not just a struggle against the soil and the seasons, it was a class struggle, a fight for the basic human right to eat the fruits of one's own labor. Therefore, we cannot understand the blandness of the pottage without understanding the laws that kept the wheat from the peasant's bowl. We cannot understand the danger of poaching without understanding the system of privilege that valued a deer's life over a man's. And we cannot understand the hardship of the Lenten fast without understanding the moral framework that told the peasant his suffering was the will of God. The story of why medieval food sucked is ultimately a story of power. It is the story of a society where a small, heavily armed elite controlled the most fundamental resource of all, food, and used that control to maintain a system of profound and brutal inequality. We have traveled from the peasant's smoky hut to the Lord's great hall. We've tasted the endless, gritty pottage and marveled at the illusory spectacle of a peacock dressed in its feathers. We've navigated the brutal laws that guarded a large deer and the complex doctrines that governed a Lenten fast. Now, we must put all these pieces together and ask the final, most important question: what was the cumulative effect of all this? What was the long-term legacy of a food system built on a foundation of scarcity and inequality? The answer is that this system left deep and lasting scars, not just on the bodies of medieval people, but on their society, their culture, and the very course of history. Let's begin with the most direct and visceral consequence: the impact on the human body. The medieval peasant was, by our standards, chronically and profoundly malnourished. It wasn't always a case of acute, camera-ready starvation, but a persistent, grinding lack of essential nutrients that defined their entire existence from the cradle to an early grave. Their diet, overwhelmingly dominated by a single type of grain, provided calorie as the raw fuel for labor, but it was a woefully incomplete package. Archaeological evidence from medieval cemeteries tells a grim story. Skeletons of peasants are typically shorter than those of the aristocracy, a direct result of stunted growth in childhood due to protein and calcium deficiencies. The bones often show evidence of Harris lines, which are markers of arrested growth, indicating periods during childhood when the body was so starved of nutrients that it temporarily stopped growing. This wasn't an exception, it was the norm. The very skeletons of these people are a fossil record of their hunger. Their teeth tell an equally sad tale. The coarse, gritty bread, full of stone dust from the mill, acted like sandpaper, wearing down the enamel of their teeth over the years. This, combined with a lack of dental hygiene, led to widespread tooth decay, abscesses, and eventual tooth loss. For many medieval people, the simple act of chewing was a source of chronic pain. The lack of specific vitamins left them vulnerable to a host of deficiency diseases that we now only read about in history books. We've mentioned scurvy, the scourge of late winter, caused by a lack of vitamin C from fresh fruits and vegetables. Its symptoms were horrific: rotting gums, loose teeth, reopening of old wounds, and eventually, death. Rickets, caused by a lack of vitamin D, would have been common in the sun-deprived north, leading to softened, deformed bones in children. Anemia, from a lack of iron in a diet so sparse in red meat, would have led to a constant state of fatigue, weakness, and a pale complexion, making the back-breaking labor of the fields even more exhausting. This pervasive malnutrition created a population with severely compromised immune systems. They were living in a world teeming with pathogens in their water, in their food, on the filthy streets, and their bodies were ill-equipped to fight them off. A simple infection that a well-nourished person might easily recover from could prove fatal for a medieval peasant. Minor cuts could become septic. A common cold could turn into a deadly pneumonia. This is one of the key reasons why life expectancy was so brutally short. It wasn't just that they faced plagues and famines, it was that their baseline level of health was so precarious that they were perpetually vulnerable. This constant state of poor health had a profound impact on the medieval psyche. Life was fragile and fleeting. Death was a constant and familiar presence in every village and every family. The death of infants and young children was an ordinary tragedy. A woman might give birth to 10 children and be lucky if 3 or 4 survived to adulthood. This fragility of life, so deeply connected to the insecurity of the food supply, helps to explain the overwhelming power of the Church. The promise of a better life after death, a heavenly feast to compensate for a lifetime of earthly hunger, was a message of immense power and comfort to a population that had little else to hope for, beyond the individual body. This food system shaped the very structure of society and the economy. Because agriculture was so inefficient and crop yields were so low, the vast majority of the population, and perhaps as high as 90%, had to be farmers. They were all trapped in the relentless, year-long struggle to produce just enough food to survive and pay their dues. This left very few people available for other professions, to be artisans, scholars, engineers, or artists. The lack of a significant food surplus was a brake on the development of civilization. It's no accident that the great flowering of culture, science, and art in the Renaissance happened in parallel with innovations in agriculture and the expansion of trade networks that made food more secure, at least for the urban centers. The entire rhythm of medieval life was dictated by the food calendar. The seasons of plowing, planting, and harvesting were not just agricultural activities, they were the defining events of the year, around which all social and religious life was organized. The period after the harvest was a time of relative plenty and celebration. The hungry gap in the late spring, when the winter stores had run out and the new crops were not yet ready, was a time of collective anxiety and belt-tightening. This cycle of boom and bust, of feast and famine, was the inescapable reality. This precariousness also led to a deep-seated social conservatism. When your survival is on a knife's edge, you don't take risks. You plant the same crops your father planted, using the same methods, because you know they will probably yield just enough to get by. Innovation was dangerous. A failed experiment with a new crop could mean starvation for your entire family. This helps explain why agricultural practices changed so slowly for much of the Middle Ages. The system was designed for subsistence and the extraction of surplus for the elite, not for growth or experimentation. Now, let's try the thought experiment again, but in reverse. Imagine we could bring a modern nutritionist, a food scientist, and a chef back to the medieval world. The nutritionist would be horrified by the rampant deficiencies. The food scientist would be aghast at the complete lack of hygiene and the primitive preservation methods. But the chef might find a few glimmers of something interesting. Amidst all the hardship, the medieval food world was, in its own way, intensely local and seasonal. People ate what grew around them, and they ate it in its proper season, because they had no other choice. The peasant housewife, for all her limited ingredients, possessed a deep, practical knowledge of her local environment. She knew which wild herbs could add flavor to the pottage, how to preserve the autumn harvest of apples, and how to make a nourishing meal from the humblest of ingredients. This was not the romantic, artisanal cooking we celebrate today. It was a grim necessity, but it represented a profound and intimate connection between people and the source of their food. A connection that we have largely lost in our age of the global supermarket. And as the Middle Ages drew to a close, the seeds of change were already being sown. The Black Death, for all its horror, had a transformative effect. The massive loss of population meant that labor was suddenly in short supply. For the first time, surviving peasants had bargaining power. They could demand higher wages and better conditions. Many left the manors they had been tied to for generations and moved to the growing towns and cities. This began the slow erosion of the feudal system. With more land available and fewer mouths to feed, the diet of the average person actually improved for a time in the late 14th and 15th centuries. More people could afford to eat meat and a wider variety of foods. The age of exploration was dawning, and with it came the Columbian Exchange. The arrival of potatoes, corn, and tomatoes from the Americas would eventually revolutionize the European diet, providing new, high-yield sources of calories and nutrients that would help to support a growing population. The spice trade, once a trickle of unimaginable luxury, began to expand, and over centuries, flavors that were once reserved for kings slowly made their way into the kitchens of ordinary people. The journey from the medieval table to our own was long, slow, and complex. It was driven by plagues and revolutions, by scientific discoveries and technological innovations, by the slow, painful struggle for social and economic justice. We are the fortunate inheritors of that long history. The abundance, variety, and safety of the food we enjoy today is a privilege that was bought by the suffering and toil of countless generations. So, when we look back at the medieval world, it's easy to be shocked by the grimness of their food's reality. It's easy to feel a sense of superiority, to be thankful that we do not have to live on a diet of gritty bread and endless gruel. But perhaps a more profound response is one of humility. The story of medieval food is a humbling reminder of our own vulnerability. It shows us how fragile the systems that feed us can be, and how quickly the privilege of a full belly can be taken for granted. It teaches us that a just and equitable society must have, at its very core, the principle that everyone has a right to safe, nourishing, and dignified food. For in the end, the story of what's in our bowl is the story of who we are. We have reached the end of this long, and at times, difficult journey into the past. We've spent hours together exploring the filth, the famine, and the feasts of the Middle Ages. If you've stayed with me this whole time, thank you. Your curiosity and attention are what make creating these deep dives so rewarding. If you found this exploration of our culinary history valuable, and maybe even a little bit fascinating despite the grim details, please consider giving this video a like. It's a small click for you, but it makes a huge difference in helping this channel reach more people who are curious about our shared past. And if you want to ensure you don't miss our next multi-hour exploration of the stories that have made us who we are, then I'd be honored if you would click that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Become a part of our community here at Boring History Guy, where we believe that history, no matter how distant or difficult, is always worth understanding. Thank you once again for your time and for joining me on this journey. I look forward to seeing you in the next one.